Welcome to the Purpose-Focused Advisor, a podcast for financial planners, advisors, and RIAs looking to get the most out of yourself and your business. Join Rob Brown as he walks you through a journey that will allow you to take action in your business and your life so you can be the best that you can possibly be. Now here's your host, Rob.
The Purpose-Focused Advisor, your host, Rob Brown here. And I'm excited today to have with me Antony Joffe, who is the Chairman of Sterling Trustees, who works with a lot of advisors. So it's great to have him on our podcast. And he also, through his company, says grace over about 10 billion with a B assets under administration. So he's obviously doing a lot with a lot of advisors and a lot of the clients that you serve. So I thought it'd be great to get Antony on board and talk about why you would have a trust company in South Dakota. Antony, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. Good question, and question that gets asked all the time. But what a lot of people don't know today is South Dakota really is the biggest trust situs in the country. I mean, they've got more assets than I think Delaware is probably the closest by a factor of 2. So it really has become a really progressive state for trusts, and creates a lot of opportunities for clients around the country and around the world, as well as for investment advisors if they sort of understand what you can do.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as the show goes along. But before we do, Antony, give us a little bit of your background. How did you get to where you are with Sterling Trustees, because you kind of came out of I call it the dark side of the investment business, the mergers and acquisition side, but you've done something completely different.
Yeah. So my dad and I are actually partners in the business. We're both actually originally from South Africa. He was a practicing trust and estates attorney, and really developed a practice when he moved here around helping wealthy offshore families, mainly South Africa, Europe, South America, where they had families emigrating to the United States, had money offshore in trust and wanted to bring it onshore here to the U.S. And what ended up happening was he became the independent trustee to a lot of the families. And so over a period of years, built up to a point where he had about $800 million of assets that he was personally responsible for, started thinking about succession planning and what happens if he got hit by the proverbial bus, and wanted to make sure that his clients were taken care of, and sort of had the idea to start a South Dakota chartered trust company, move all the assets out of his name into this entity, and be able to have some longevity after he passed, to pass it down to members of my family. My background, I'm a CPA by training, did my 2 years of indentured servitude with Coopers & Lybrand, and then, as you said, was on the dark side for 15 years with Janney Montgomery Scott on the investment banking side. And I guess my dad called me at the end of 2007 as the market was going to hell in a handbasket, and seemed like a good time to get out of the investment banking world into a more recurring revenue business. And so, I joined him, and, here we are 17 years later with, about 10 billion of assets across about 500 trusts and about 200 families. So, it's been an interesting ride.
So it's quite an about face from leaving your investment banking world, moving into the trust side of things. But I'm curious, what's it like having got into business with your dad? I talk to a lot of advisors as they're building their businesses. They have a dream. I'd love to have my son or my daughter, come in to work with me. And sometimes it happens and it works out. Sometimes it happens and it doesn't work out, and other times it just doesn't happen at all. But I think that idea of a family business and being the second generation at Sterling is kind of a cool thing to talk about.
Yeah, no, I've been lucky in that respect. I mean, my dad and I get along very well, and, knock on wood, we haven't wanted to kill each other yet in the 17 years that we've been in business. I think part of that is I think we both respect each other, and I think the other thing is we just bring very complementary skills. I mean, he's obviously got a legal background. I have more of an accounting, investment management background. So I think it blends well, and especially when it comes to trust. I mean, there's so many skill sets you really have to bring to the table to be, good in that industry. And it is the legal, the tax, accounting, investment knowledge, and whatnot. So I think that's really helped us to maybe stay in our respective lanes and not cross each other, and be able to get along with each other over the last 17
I think
plus
that
years.
comes out a lot in the multi-generational families that work together. They find lanes. Because both people can't be doing the exact same things, and you have to find a way to separate those things. So I had forgotten from our first conversation that your dad brought you into the business, and so I wasn't even thinking to bring that up until you mentioned it. So let's go back. Yeah. Let's switch gears. Financial advisors, especially RIAs and independent advisors, often ask me, Rob, I need some trust services. I don't want to go to the big banks or maybe even the medium-sized banks, because as soon as I take business over to them on the trustee side, they'll start cherry-picking what they want and take away my investment business or my planning business. And I also know that there's some great attorneys here in town that do trust work, but it's not their full-time gig, and they may not be a real advocate for my business and my clients and really staying abreast of the best things to do. So that's, to me, where that independent trust company comes in. And of course, there are local independent trust companies too, but like, kind of why South Dakota, and talk about some of those barriers or some of those challenges that you see advisors facing, because I'm assuming that you get a good bit of your business through introductions from family offices and financial advisors who are growing big businesses.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think coming at a couple different angles. As you sort of rightly pointed out, I mean, I think RIAs are really nervous about referring obviously trust services to the bank trust companies. Because of service tends to be pretty poor, and there is that risk that they could call up the client and say, hey, why don't you just bring the investment business in-house? We can do it all under one roof and whatnot. I think where South Dakota shine is they've created what's called a non-depository trust company, which is us. So we don't manage any assets ourselves. We're purely acting as a trustee, and it really allows us to eliminate all the conflict of interest that exists within most bank trust companies. I mean, the biggest one is really sort of distribution bias. And what I mean by that is when a client calls up and wants a distribution, most of the bank trust companies make you stand on your head to prove that you actually need it, because if they distribute the assets out, it lowers their AUM, which lowers their fees. And so, there's that disincentive there to make the distribution. When you have an independent trustee serving in that role, we have no axe to grind, and therefore, a client wants a distribution, we can turn it around same day. It doesn't affect our fees or our assets under administration because we get paid on a fixed fee basis. So we eliminate all that conflict of interest. And I really think at the end of the day, it really is the best model for the client, because you've got an independent trustee, independent investment advisor, and then typically an independent custodian as well. So you have good separation of duties. And, I think that really helps the client out in the long run in terms of eliminating potential for fraud or negligence or anything like that within the model.
So dig into that a little bit deeper, because when I first met you, we were talking about that trifurcation really that happens on your or that can happen with somebody who works with your platform and wants to separate out those duties. Talk about that separation of duties and why that's something important to consider. I'm guessing it's not necessary for everybody, but for those it's necessary too. It's good to understand that.
Yeah, so I think maybe what you're referring to is South Dakota has what's called directed trust statutes. And so in a directed trust, in addition to the trustee, you can also name two other individuals into the trust. It also could be a committee, but the two other people that would serve in the trust would be the investment advisor and the distribution advisor. I'll start with the easy one first, the distribution advisor. I mean, typically the distribution advisor is going to make all the distribution decisions in the trust, and all they do is they inform us as the trustee what that distribution is and to who, and then we will, send out the wire or act on those instructions. So typically they'll name like a family member or somebody that's closer to the family that maybe understands family dynamics a little bit better to make those decisions. So it gives the family a little bit of modicum of control, over the trust. The second one that's really interesting is really the investment advisor role, and it works sort of one of two ways. Typically, it's a family member gets appointed as the investment advisor. They're in charge of then going out and finding the underlying financial advisor to manage the assets. They make all the investment decisions and whatnot, and all we do as a trustee is open up any of the account opening paperwork and anything like that. And so in the directed model, there's really sort of no risk for the trustee. Most of the fiduciary risk lays with the distribution advisor and the investment advisor. Where it gets interesting for the financial advisor is the financial advisor could be the investment advisor. And I'm sorry to use sort of two terms sort of interlock there, but for an investment advisor's client, if they've got trust, I mean, they can approach their clients and say, hey, why don't you name me as the investment advisor in the directed trust? That way, when you pass away, I'll still be here. I can continue on your legacy. I know how you want to manage the assets because we've been doing it for a long time together. So it allows the investment advisor to have that continuity. Allows him to, maybe the easiest way to say it is typically if your client's assets aren't in trust when they die, you've got about a 20% chance of holding on to them. If they're in trust, it's about an 80% chance. So it really behooves the investment advisor to be talking to their clients about directed trusts and how it can potentially affect their business and the longevity of their accounts long term.
That's a great point, because I think a lot of advisors take that ability to continue working with the next generation for granted, and may even do some things to create a bit of a personal relationship, but don't get the opportunity to actually work with that next generation regularly. And then something happens, and all of a sudden there are lots of interested parties in figuring out how they can help with the succession of those assets. And so that trust makes it stickier. I'm surprised. I mean, it seems like a big gap, 20 to 80%. And I guess on one sense it makes perfect sense, but on the other sense it seems like an outsized number.
Yeah, no, I mean it is pretty interesting, and I think the biggest issue is really I think a lot of investment advisors don't feel comfortable talking to their clients about trusts. Some of them just don't understand the ins and outs and the nuances, and maybe the client has a trust and estate attorney that they trust more, and so it becomes somewhat a difficult conversation, and that's why some of these things sort of go under the radar or escape the investment advisor. And I think that's really where an independent trustee like ourselves can come to play. We can sit with you at the table and be able to answer those questions on behalf of the investment advisor so that they understand it better, and the client understands it and what the opportunity is. So you're not risking sitting down with a bank trust company, for example, where their ulterior motives are maybe a little bit different than ours. So I think that's really I think the biggest issue here is really just lack of knowledge on the investment advisor as to what potentially can happen long term.
So talk about maybe some of the top 2 or 3 things that an investment advisor and his or her client might run into as it relates to not having a trust that maybe they're not aware of, that would make the value that the advisor is bringing and introducing the trustee even more important.
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, there's lots of different things. I mean, for wealthier families, if you haven't had trust sets set up and you've got assets in excess of the lifetime gift exemption, you potentially put yourself into an estate tax situation. And so sort of being able to identify that and, what other solutions you can bring to the table to hopefully mitigate that, I think is helpful. Obviously, some of the other big challenges that families face are, their kids aren't prepared to manage wealth. They may be good members of society and functioning members of society, but, they don't understand investments and tax and accounting. And, parents are worried about leaving millions of dollars, potentially directly to their kids. And that's where, trusts and having a trustee or independent trustee, makes a lot of sense. The other thing that families worry about is, you don't know who your kids are going to marry. And what happens if you land up in a divorce and you've got, a bunch of assets in your name? Do those assets potentially leave the coop and, go to the ex-divorcing spouse? So there's lots of situations that come up. And, that's where, again, we want to be a resource to the investment advisor to be able to help them navigate through that and use us as a resource to do that.
So let's talk about like a best case scenario. There's an advisor maybe that, has a significant relationship, is kind of doubling down on saying, okay, what else should I be doing to prepare my client for the future? And I've not spent a lot of time thinking about how a trust or a trustee might play into that. How do they work best with you in introducing that so that they can educate the client? Because that's, to me, that has to be a big part of it when you're adding value and introducing new ideas. There's an educational component to it, but then in that education, how do you, kind of stir up the right kind of conversations without stirring up trouble? Because like the one that you just mentioned in terms of divorcing, that can be a sticky issue if it's never been thought of before.
Yeah. No, listen, I think a good financial advisor, they hopefully over time really get to know their clients and, should be able to have these types of deep personal conversations with their clients if they're sort of worth their weight in gold and whatnot. But a lot of it is, as you said, educational. And that's really, what we spend a lot of time is producing content that educates investment advisors on trusts, how to use them. What are the differences between using a South Dakota trust versus a Delaware trust versus Tennessee or New Hampshire, which are some of the other, good trust states out there. So it is education. And if you think you have an opportunity, pick up the phone and talk to us and we can give you some ideas. Again, we have no axe to grind. We're not going to steal your business. We're here to be a partner with you. And, if we can do a good job doing that, it leads to repeat business. And we have the opportunity as well as being an independent trustee to refer money back out to investment advisors. So you can get into a nice sort of, the best referrals are the two-way referrals where I can refer business and vice versa. So, that's what I found.
That
I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. That true strategic partnership, not just give me, and I'll give you if I find a chance. So talk about maybe give me an idea of who some of your best advisor. What your best advisor relationships look like. Obviously not naming names. When you think about some of the things that you see some of the best in class who are working with you doing, what are they maybe doing differently than somebody who's just dipping, his or her toes in the water when it comes to exploring, introducing trust to their clients?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, again, just goes back to education. I think a lot of these guys really understand trusts. Some of the firms that we work with actually have trust and estate attorneys on board, and so they're able to have some of those discussions with the end client. And when they do have a trust opportunity, they can introduce us in. So there is a built-in knowledge base within the firm on trusts. So that obviously makes it a little bit easier. If you don't have that, then again, we want to be that resource and, have that RIA or investment advisor pick up the phone and run the opportunity by us, and we can give them help on how to approach the client, what to say, throw out some ideas and, at least get the conversation going. And then, either you're bringing a trust and estate attorney to the table along with us to hopefully put together a plan that makes sense and makes the advisor look like the hero at the end of the day.
Does that relationship with the attorney is that? I'm just kind of wondering how that is, because sometimes attorneys can be the obstacle to advancing business because they don't maybe do the level of trust work that you do as a trustee. So I imagine in some cases it's an education process there as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, particularly when you tell people we're going to set up a trust in South Dakota, a lot of attorneys are just like, well, why would I want to do that? I mean, a lot of attorneys sort of understand the trust law in their own state, and that's all they know. And unfortunately, some of them aren't willing to open their ears and find out about other opportunities, for enhancing their clients' wealth. I mean, if you're living in a high tax state like California, where you're paying 13% state income tax and capital gains tax, and you've got an opportunity to move assets to South Dakota where you pay no state income tax or capital gains tax. If I'm an attorney, I would be all ears. I mean, it's almost malpractice if you're not thinking about doing that for your client. So, yeah, there is some education on the lawyer side. There, I think lawyers too, unfortunately, tend to be sort of possessive of their clients. So they're not willing to make referrals a lot of the time, or are scared to make referrals because they think they might lose the client. So, those are some of the things that you run into. But, I think obviously if you're working with a good attorney that understands, these various states and what they bring to the table, it'll be a much better experience.
So you just talked about the tax side of things and your California versus South Dakota example. Give me some other, key South Dakota differences that that you regularly take advantage of in the work that you do with your clients.
Sure. Yeah. Well, obviously, the state tax is a huge thing. The other thing that South Dakota has is no rule against perpetuities, meaning you can have a trust that, goes on forever. So for, very wealthy families, that's a great way to, pass wealth down multiple generations and potentially eliminate GST tax. The other the big things for our clients is really asset protection and privacy. So from an asset protection standpoint, once the assets are in trust for 2 years, they really become bulletproof for creditors. So, families, and for us, our families, when creditor protection is, what happens if your kids get divorced and, the ex-spouse wants to attack the trust, having those assets in trust, obviously, and the asset protection that it affords is really helpful. On the privacy side, there's really two things that, our families find important. The first is, if the trust is ever made part of a lawsuit, you can have it permanently sealed in South Dakota, so it'll never see the light of day. And again, in a divorcing situation where ex-spouse wants at the trust documents or statements and whatnot, you can have them sealed and, it'll never see the light of day. The client would, or the ex-spouse would have to go to South Dakota and get in front of a judge and, plead their case. And, I don't think they're going to get very far. I think the other one that's really interesting is, most states at the age of 18, you have to notify the beneficiaries of the trust, the existence of the trust, and they're entitled to get statements and whatnot. So you can imagine an 18-year-old kid going off to college finds out they're the beneficiary of a $5, $10, $100 million trust. I mean, sort of a great way to sort of stifle their ambition and whatnot. And South Dakota's silent as to that. So you can have I don't want the beneficiaries ever knowing about this trust, or you can put ages in there. So once they get to age 40 and they're functioning members of society, then, they can know about the existence of the trust. And hopefully at that point, the trust becomes sort of a safety blanket. So for, ultra wealthy families or wealthy families, this is a great way to sort of protect their kids, long term, if, they're not talking about wealth from a young age to these kids, so that, they've learned how to respect money and, make sure that doesn't become an issue, longer term.
Yeah, well, those are some great things that the advisors who are listening to this can be thinking about, because I'm sure that many people in the audience are they're hearing those questions, and they're seeing those things as they're having their planning conversations with their clients. Yep. So I was thinking about your statistics before, where you said that there's an 80% chance that an advisor will keep a relationship after the death of a client when it's in trust versus 20% if it's not. What about and then when you're just talking about the kids going off to college and knowing they've got the trust that can fund their fraternity parties? does wealth last longer in trust naturally? Maybe not just because of South Carolina, but because you're structuring something in a way that allows for proper kind of education over time around wealth with people who are, they're growing up in the world and they just don't have that exposure.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the purpose behind trust is to make that wealth last longer and not get it into a kid's hands that maybe has spending issues, that blows it or makes bad investments, or isn't knowledgeable about investments and potentially gets hoodwinked or whatnot. So I mean, there are lots of things that can go wrong if your kids aren't prepared to handle wealth, and it's always sort of a touchy subject for parents, kids growing up. Do you talk about your wealth or what you've accumulated, and how do you teach your kids about money and to respect money so that if they were to know about a trust, that it wouldn't be a situation where they just want to live off it and not want to be functioning members of society. And so I think that's the interesting part of our job is sort of managing that and managing the beneficiaries and the kids and their expectations, and and a lot of them is educating them on wealth and how it works, and how to read an investment statement, how to get on the phone with the investment advisor and do a review of the portfolio with them, and making sure they get to understand how this all works, so that they become educated and knowledgeable about trust, investments, and everything that goes into it.
In fact, I was thinking anybody else who's listened to this podcast who's been around wealth and families planning for a lot of years, I can remember early in my career talking to someone who had created this very restrictive trust for his children, and there were age bands that just seemed unrealistically tight for when money would be released and all that sort of thing. And as I watched what happened after that person passed away, he was a really smart guy. You knew that he knew exactly what he was doing, because you watched the heirs kind of blow the first chunk of money that they had unencumbered access to, but some of it, more of it lasted and was around until they got used to what it was like to have that wealth, and they grew into it, and now they're very responsible stewards of the assets they've been left, and they've grown it. So it's a cool thing to think about, protecting, but also preserving and creating legacy out into the future. Yeah.
No, listen, I mean, this is, if it is your parents' legacy that they've created, hopefully you respect your parents and want to see this legacy get passed down to multiple generations. And, so you've got to be a good steward for your generation and, pass it on to your kids and your kids' kids and whatnot, so that money lasts and whatnot. So, it's interesting. I mean, there's just so many machinations that can go on here, and as the grantor putting the money into the trust, it's hard to rule from the grave, and you want your kids to enjoy it, but you've also got to protect them long term if they don't have the skills to be able to manage it.
That's great. So I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes for the best way for folks listening to this to get in touch with you. But before I do that, we begin to land the plane, what's anything else that you really want to pass along about what you're doing with Sterling Trustees that our audience should know about, or about the South Dakota Trust, is a better place to have things in general? What have we missed? I'm sure there's a lot.
I don't think we've really missed anything. The one thing I would say is, a lot of people say, well, I live in Texas or California or New York. Why do I need a South Dakota trust? And I think that's the key thing here. It doesn't matter where you live; you can still take advantage of the progressive trust laws in South Dakota. So, I think a lot of people just don't understand that or get that, and I think that's something that we have to sort of misspell here, or dispel, I should say. So I think that's the biggest one. And, the next is, again, as I said earlier, we're here to be a resource. It's a touchy subject matter, and it is an educational type sale to the end client. And so you've got to really feel comfortable to be able to do it. And, a lot of advisors aren't, but they know there's opportunities there to be had. So that's where really we can sit at the table with them and help them to, unearth those and hopefully grow their book of business and make those assets much more valuable longer term. Because I don't know if you probably do know the statistics, but I think the average agency account at an investment advisor is about 7 years. It's about 17 years for a trust account. So it really enhances the overall value of your book of business long
and
term.
we talk a lot about enhancing the value of a business for the RIAs that we work with, and there's another perfect example. So that's great. And this is, I think, maybe a big reason that I wanted to have you on the show, and I'm sure you won't take offense to this. Trust can be boring. So, talking about trust for a half an hour on a podcast might not turn a lot of people on until you understand that there are people and companies like yours who are not only serving the clients of the advisors who are listening to this podcast, or that the advisors that I work with, but also serving those advisors, because we all need to learn more and grow and understand issues that we may not touch on every day, but they can be consequential to the value of our businesses or to the success of our clients. So let's wrap with Antony. What's the best way for someone to get to know you? You've offered to pick up the phone and talk to people about their cases. Talk about the best way to do that.
Yeah, probably the best way is just to call me directly. My direct phone number is 610-234-0626. Or you can get me on my email, which is ajoffe@sterlingtrustees.com, and go to our website. We've got a wealth of information on there about trust and the various jurisdictions and trust laws and various kinds of trusts and all that. So there's a wealth of information there, and that's sterlingtrustees.com is the URL. So, pick up the phone, give me a call. I'm happy to have a conversation.
That's awesome.
Whenever.
I love that, and we'll be sure to put that info into our show notes. So, Antony, great to have you on the show. To our audience, thanks for listening in today. We will see you next week, and as always, we are rooting for your success. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Purpose-Focused Advisor. If you want to learn more, head over to our website, truestfancoaching.com. There you'll learn all about becoming a purpose-focused advisor. You'll also find today's show notes and links to the other gifts and resources we talked about during the episode. Again, thanks for listening, and remember, we're rooting for your success.